Hey, welcome back to my channel. As promised, I'm going to show you how to paint this sunset skyline step by step that we tried to paint together in my last live stream. Thank you again to everyone who joined. Now before I start painting, I like to prepare a sketch first. Here I used just regular paper from a notebook and divide it in half because I want my painting to be half the size. To make it slightly more accurate, I also added additional lines for the frame because here I will be adding the tape later to create a white frame around the painting. Let's start with planning out the horizon. In this painting, I sketch it out with a simple line by dividing the page into thirds, so the lower third will be the area where we will add the buildings later. Now, when it comes to drawing buildings, you need to consider what the perspective is. How many points do you have to keep in mind? Here, I wanted to focus on 1 point perspective and adjust everything accordingly. Now, this point is outside the actual drawing, so I added it along the horizon just a little bit further away. So if you would draw a house now, you can start with the vertical lines first. They have to be parallel to the outer vertical edges. To create the horizontal lines, you can then create a guideline from the corner of the line to the point of the chosen perspective. Now, since the building is around the same height as the point we decided on, it looks almost like a straight line on top of the building. But if the houses are lower than that, you will see the difference. For the other buildings, I did the same. I created the vertical lines parallel to the left side and then connected the corners with the point on the right to create the guideline. These guidelines will always tell you how tall or narrow the building has to be in different areas in the painting. Now, technically, there's another second point that we need to keep in mind, and that's where we have to connect the rooftop area. Since it's also outside the picture, I tried to imagine where it could be and created a diagonal line to the side. And this line I will just use as a reference for the future rooftop lines. You can of course create the guidelines first and then place the buildings accordingly. Now this is something you have to just practice because constructing buildings like that can be very confusing, but it really helps to learn about how wide or narrow certain things have to be in which part of the drawing. If you want to learn more about it, you can Google for 1 point or 2 point perspective to see examples and tutorials to get familiar with that. From here, I went ahead and created a couple of more buildings, trying to make it look similar to my reference picture that I will have linked in the description box down below, by the way. As you can see, I only focused on creating a few buildings in the foreground and just lightly sketched out the rest that is further away, as we won't draw them that accurately anyway. I also sketched out the sun in the center and a few random buildings along the horizon. Once you're happy with the sketch and you adjusted everything until you're happy with it, we can move on to the watercolor paper. Here I'm going to use 140-pound cold pressed paper that is 100% cotton by the brand called Hahnemuhle. To tape it down to my desk, I'm using the pink Tesa tape for sensitive surfaces. Now to transfer the sketch, I'm going to use actual transfer paper this time that is wax-free to trace everything onto my watercolor paper. But if you have seen some of my other tutorials, you can also create a layer of pencil lead on the backside of the sketch and then transfer it the same way. The pencil layer will serve as a transfer film. And this is how it looks once transferred onto the paper. Since my transfer paper is made with graphite and is wax-free, I can easily erase things and adjust anything I need. Here I wanted to move the sun a little bit because it was not in the center and it kind of bugged me. Alright, let's finally add some color to the painting. Here I'm going to use watercolor in the colors Cadmium Yellow, Cerulean Blue, and Magenta. First, let's start with a light layer of blue colored paint for the sky. Begin by loading up your brush with water and a little bit of blue paint. And then distribute it starting on the top of the paper and then moving downwards with the brush from left to right, back and forth. Add more water and paint if necessary. You want to cover the first third of the paper with blue paint. Then clean your brush and load it up with yellow paint. Now you can go ahead and outline the sun and the skyline like I do it here. You only need a little bit of yellow paint around for now. For this painting, I'm using only one round brush by the brand called Vinci because it's so versatile. Next, clean your brush again and load it up with magenta or any other red or pinkish color. While the yellow paint is still wet, add paint to the left and right side and lightly blend it into the yellow color to create a bright orange. But you still want to keep a little bit of the yellow color right around the sun. From here, I moved my brush from left to right to blend everything together, moving upwards, but stopped right below the blue colored sky. Now here you want to be careful because the yellow and blue can easily turn into green. So what you can do now is you can use a clean damp brush to carefully blend the orangey color that is already on the paper slightly into the blue to connect the two colors together just a little bit. To intensify the sky a little bit more, I created another layer of blue colored paint and repeated the steps. Here again, don't move too much into the orangey color below. Now with sunsets, you can play around so much because every sunset is unique. So here, for example, I added a little bit more magenta to the orangey part and also to the blue sky to create these purple clouds. You can also add a little bit of the orange color on top to create all sorts of sun reflections in the clouds. From here, I simply moved my brush from left to right, back and forth, to add a few thin lines here and there to add a hint of color that is around the sun. I think this makes the sun look a lot more magical and it gives the whole sky a warmer feeling. The important part here is that you shouldn't let the paint dry while you blend all these colors together, because you will either create blotchy results if you add too much water to a dry area, or it will be hard to create smooth gradients between certain colors if that's what you're going for. And if some areas are already dry, you can still reactivate them by painting over them to give you more time to play around. Once the sky is dry, use a clean damp brush and carefully reactivate the yellow edge around the white sun and lightly blend it inside the center. Here you basically want to reactivate the yellow color to create a glowing effect. If this doesn't work, you can also just use the same yellow color and dilute it with water and apply it inside the circle the same way. When everything is completely dry, we can start painting the buildings. Here you want to create one layer of paint using the gradient effect. So first, apply a thin layer of water on top of the buildings and then distribute the same blue color starting on the lower corner of the paper while moving upwards following a more or less diagonal line until you reach the horizon. The closer you get to it, the lighter the blue color should become. And on top, where the buildings meet the sun, you want to use the same pinkish color from the beginning and add it on top while lightly blending it downwards following the same diagonal line. This way you create this nice purple color that is also in the sky. Here you want to work quickly so the colors can blend into each other seamlessly. Let everything dry and then we can add the details to the buildings. Here you want to keep the different light situation in mind. First, I simply started off by outlining different houses using the same blue color following the pencil guidelines. And then I filled in the squares with the same blue color to make them darker. So here I made the right side of the short buildings darker because sometimes they were standing really close to each other or because there were trees in between covering the sun. The rooftops are the lightest parts and the rest of the buildings is something in between. And when it came to the purple area, I used purple colored paint that I mixed with the cerulean blue and magenta again, and then outlined the windows and also added a few loose lines for the buildings that are far away. Now this is the general look of the houses we are going to work with, a very early stage. From here you can adjust the color intensity and add additional sun reflections. So for example, the rooftops get a lot of sunlight that also reflects on them. So here I added a light layer of orange color. And because the skyline area is really pale so far, I went ahead and outlined everything with the blue watercolor pencil. The good thing about them is that you can easily dilute them with water later and work it into the painting. But if you don't have watercolor pencils, you can of course use a thin brush and watercolors for that as well. So this is the next stage of the painting. Let's remove the tape for now and work on the painting a little bit more. I feel like most of the time when we hit this point in the painting process where we just hate our art is because we judge it too early. For example, when I removed the tape here and adjusted the houses a little bit, I wasn't really happy with the result because I felt like the sunset and the skyline don't look good together. as if I used two different art styles and mediums. On top we have the bright and colorful sunset with watercolors, and below we have like a cutout of a cartoon that's from a magazine or something. Like, it was just way too different, and I actually thought of starting over. But then I simply took a picture of it and looked it through my computer, but of course you can do that on your phone as well. And I feel like you immediately see what's wrong and what you can adjust in your painting. The lower part of the painting was simply not done yet. The outlines were too harsh, the buildings compared to that were super pale, so this is when I started applying more and more paint to the paper. I darkened the areas where the houses get less light and adjusted the rest of the house accordingly, because sometimes the darker part was way too dark compared to the rest and it just looked a little bit off. I also noticed that one of the buildings was totally crooked, so I had to fix that by erasing a little bit and then painting over it. And I also felt like there was still not enough sun reflections on the building, so I applied a very thin layer of yellow color paint, again a little bit of purple here and there. And the more I darkened some areas, the more the very bright areas that were too bright actually stood out, so I made them darker as well so it doesn't look too weird. I think the fun part of creating something is when you just play around. So I usually go for watercolor pencils whenever I want to see how it will look. So I used a white watercolor pencil here to add a few light reflections on top. And the cool thing was also that the pencil kind of smudged and blended some colors really nicely, and it added this glowing feel to the painting. Even though the skyline below the sun was already rather glowing, I still went over it with my white watercolor pencil to make everything even more glowy. I think compared to the early stages where I felt like starting over to now, it's a huge improvement. This scenery was indeed challenging to paint, but I learned so much during the process and I can't wait to practice more. If you need more watercolor painting ideas, you can check out the videos right here. I really hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Thank you so much for watching, have a wonderful day, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!